Let's talk a little about every essential element. And I guess maybe first I'd ask you, I know a little bit about you, but tell me a little more about yourself, your family, and why you felt this book was something that you really needed to do.
Yeah. Well, I feel really lucky to have been born into the family I was born. Sometimes I feel like I got the lottery. I'm the youngest child of 7, the only girl, so I have 6 brothers. People often give me a hard time about that. They're like, how spoiled were you? Yeah. Even as a kid, I kind of knew that my setup was not normal, and in a good way. Of course, there were times when we were different, and no kid wants to be too different. But my parents took me out of school several times a year, and I got to travel the country and meet the most interesting people. So we're this conservative Utah family, and I have this other life on the side where we're traveling the country and going to these health food stores with all kinds of people, the stores and the conventions, hippie types and new age types and people from all different religions and backgrounds and people into health. And I just got this background of mindfulness and of health, and my dad used to say, don't let school get in the way of your education.
That's a good comment.
I thought so.
I like that.
I was a good student, and I did my homework in the back seat of the car, but I got an extraordinary education. And so I've always felt lucky about that, and lucky to have the parents I did. They were extraordinary parents, extraordinary people. And the story that they went through, starting this business in a time when no one understood what they were doing, a time when you could not buy a loaf of whole wheat bread in the grocery store. People certainly didn't understand minerals and trace minerals if they didn't even understand whole grains. It's quite a story, and my parents really stood for something. And a few years ago, I was feeling like there was maybe some excess capacity in my life. Like there was something I should be doing with my time. And I didn't quite know what it was. Sometimes you just have that sense. And I spent a couple of months trying to figure out where this sense was coming from. And I kind of made a bucket list, things I wanted to do. And on that list, one of the things that came out was write. And I thought maybe write a book. And as I got thinking about that over time, it felt like there was something to that. And I decided one day to just sit down and write. I had no idea what to write about. I mean, I had no plan to write this book. And I set a day. I'm going to write something and just see what comes out, and we'll go from there. So I kind of cleared my life so that I would be present, for lack of a better word, and kind of have a clear mind. And got all ready, got in the shower kind of late in the day, got out of the shower, and all of a sudden all these ideas started to come. And I started to write about my parents and things they had taught me, and this faith that they had, that when you are doing something with a purpose, things have a way of working out. And I just like this flood of ideas. I mean, I didn't even get dressed. I wrapped a towel around and wrapped a towel on my head, and I'm scribbling furious notes, messy notes all over the place. And when I felt like it was done, I felt good about it, got dressed, packed up my laptop, went to a coffee shop down the street because I didn't have internet at home at the time. And I got up my computer and started to type up my notes, and I got a phone call, looked at it, didn't answer it. It was my sister-in-law. And she called back a few minutes later. She never calls me. And I thought, I better answer that. There's something going on. And I picked up the phone, and she said, Rhonda, it's your dad. This is it. And that was the day my dad passed away.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I thought maybe the reason I wanted to be present and get all that stuff cleared out was so that I could really be with my mom and be with my family. But a few days later, I was thinking about, what is my mom going to do? My parents were inseparable for 55 years. They worked together 24/7 for 30 or more of those years.
You really get a sense of that in the book, too.
Yeah. And it wasn't always easy, but they stuck it out. And I thought, what is she going to do now that she's half of a whole? And it just hit me, we should write their story.
I remember in the book, your parents started out in Bear River City, not the burgeoning metropolis by any means. What kind of prompted them to get involved with minerals and elements and you know, the trace minerals and such that this industry's kind of founded on. How'd that all begin for them?
People always ask that. Was your dad a chemist? What got him interested in this line of work? And it wasn't that. He didn't have a technical background that led him to this. They started out in Bear River City and ended up in Hooper, Utah, kind of on the shores of the Great Salt Lake, about as far west as you can get. And during that time, they were also in flux as a family and almost having that same sense that there's a purpose. There was something that they were supposed to be doing that was different. And so there was about a year when my parents were really kind of looking for what it was they were supposed to be doing. And my dad was reading articles in the Ogden Standard Examiner. And they were written by a Dr. George W. Crane. And he wrote on all kinds of issues about health and wellness and sex and relationships. And it was a syndicated column across the country, very popular. People listened to his radio program. One of his favorite topics was seawater. And he talked about how seawater and blood plasma have very similar mineral content, which I love. To me, that just seems perfect, right? That the fluids of our bodies are the same as the fluids of the earth. And he said that many of the degenerative diseases of today would go away if people would take a little bit of seawater every day. And he talked a lot about arthritis. He had parents who had arthritis, and how seawater was helping a lot of people. And one day my dad read this article and he thought, if there's something to seawater, if there's really something to what this guy is saying, well, the Great Salt Lake is just a very concentrated ocean, maybe that would work too. So he went out to the Great Salt Lake, scooped up some water, and brought it home. He had a neighbor, this little lady, who couldn't kneel down to say her prayers at night, and because she had arthritis in her knees. And he gave her some. He said, just try this and see, maybe it'll help. And her arthritis went away. And she was a very proud woman and didn't want to ask him for more. I didn't know how to buy more, so she quit taking it when she ran out, and her arthritis came back. And he followed up with her and kept giving her more, of course, but kept giving it to other people and having that experience and many others. Over a period of years, they learned not only anecdotally, but the science behind why it worked. In fact, Native Americans used to say that the Great Salt Lake was a sacred healing place. It's like they knew something that we had yet to learn in modern society.
Wow. Well, you know, I know they started the business in about 1969, and at that same time, there were other families in Utah that were kind of pursuing similar ideas with similar kinds of products and such. Talk a little about how that all came to be. Why did this emerge in Utah, and why at this kind of time in our society?
I'll address the time question first.
Okay.
What had happened, I think you have in the 1950s, a very idealistic time where people believed that the government was going to take care of us. The government that had defeated the Nazis in World War II was on our side. People believed that medicine, Western medicine, would solve a lot of our problems, and that we would just keep getting better drugs and better surgeries, and that doctors were the answer. That technology would take off and take over so many of the problems of the world. I mean, you remember the 1950s and space exploration. There was just this wide-eyed idealism about so many things. And by the end of that decade, that was starting to change. And we started to see some of the downside, the dark side of those issues. Pollution. You started to have the Cuyahoga River caught on fire.
As a native Ohioan, I'm very familiar.
Yeah. The bald eagles in Utah all but disappeared. A lot of really troubling issues. And people started to have health problems that we thought would go away because of modern medicine. And a lot of it was because of the food we were eating. It tasted marvelous. It was great. But it was nutritionally bankrupt in many ways. And people started to think maybe all of this Western medicine, this technology, and the government weren't going to take care of us. The Vietnam War was starting to break out, and there was kind of a counterculture starting to take place. And the natural health movement was really in tandem with that, with all of that. But why Utah? Utah didn't feel like that at all. My brothers, some of them said, when they read the book the first time, said, you're talking about all this rebellious stuff, and it really wasn't like that here, and it's true. BYU was no Berkeley, for sure. So why did all these supplement companies start by these little Utah Mormon families selling products. And I think there's several reasons for that. Number one, there's called the word of wisdom. In the Mormon church, it's a commandment. It's a health code that says if you do these things, you'll be blessed with health and longevity. Now, people typically think of not drinking coffee and tea and not smoking cigarettes and those things, but they don't often realize that it also means that we should eat whole grains. We should eat fruits and vegetables in their seasons. It talks about herbs. And so I think that mindset was part of the culture here and made people open to it.
In 1969, you're talking about nearing the end of the Vietnam conflict, increasingly more, I'll call it rebellion, on the part of younger generation in our country, and what they thought they could really change the world dramatically by doing things differently. In all of that, when your parents all of a sudden in Utah decide they're going to take off down this path, I mean, how did people react to that? How did they treat them? What was that all like?
They didn't get it at all. They mocked. They really thought that my parents had gone kooky, and they snickered. My parents really felt that a lot of their friends and neighbors were saying, "What are those crazy Andersons doing?" And they had a difficult time making it financially for many years. They just lived from order to order and barely. My dad would pack up the car with enough product in it. He would hawk his guns to get enough money to get on the road, and not enough money to get home. You would have to sell the product in his car to get home. That's faith. And people saw that and thought, I would never do that.
Well, probably, some of the chief antagonists of the time were probably the FDA. I mean, I recognize, especially from reading in segments of the book, about kind of how they really tried to end this before it began with some of the things they were doing. Tell me a little about that part, how your parents reacted to that. Ultimately, how did all that kind of reflect back on Americans today and how we view that kind of health issue?
So my parents had no idea what they were in for in regard to the FDA, and there was this fight going on between natural alternatives and the kind of mainstream medicine. And it was intensifying, but the FDA had targeted products, seawater products, almost 10 years before my parents got into business. And I believe it was 1961, there was a Congress on Medical Quackery, where the AMA and the FDA and all these organizations got together and declared war on quackery. And by quackery, I mean whole grain breads, seawater products, nutritional supplements of any kind.
The Wonder Bread was considered to be the health food of the day.
It really was. And they were talking about the skill and ingenuity of our fine food manufacturers, Twinkies, all of those products at the time. And they officially declared war on seawater products. And my parents were in for it. So a few years later, they started in business and they started to get knocks on the door by the FDA and the USDA, both of them kind of working in tandem, somewhat pointing fingers at each other. And my parents tried playing nice at first. And it really was kind of a bully situation where you feel like, oh, if I just placate them, they'll go away. We'll do what they ask us to do and it'll be fine. Well, the more my parents played along, the worse it got for them. They would fix one thing and they would get another notice. And we're talking nitpicky little things. Nothing about safety, nothing about concern for consumers. They were worried about the type size. They were worried about comments like, they said the product was unheated and you couldn't say that because the sun shined on it. Are you kidding me? But it was that sort of thing. And at some point, my dad had to realize this is a bully situation, and the only way they are going to go away is if we stand up to them. So they had confiscated some products off the shelves, and they showed up at my parents' house. And it's the second time. First time they showed up, they asked to look around, and my dad says, "You got a search warrant?" And they didn't, so they left and came back with a search warrant. Second time they came back, my dad gave them an earful and said, "All right, let me see that search warrant," and saw on the bottom that it said, "and elsewhere," that you could search "and elsewhere." And my dad thought that might be invalid, and you guys go search elsewhere, just like it says on this warrant. But he basically stood them down and said, "You are not going to bully my family, and if you don't, one of us is not going to be here." You know what I mean? And they left and actually never came back. during all that, years and years later, never bullied my family's company again. Probably went on to people that would be less trouble.
Oh yeah, took a tremendous amount of pressure, I'm sure, off the family too. You know, the book's intended as a memoir, but it's written more like a novel and more like from your mother's voice. Why did you choose to go that route?
It's interesting. When I first started writing, I was kind of writing lessons that I learned from my parents. And at some point I realized it's a story. My parents are characters in the best possible way. You know, you grow up thinking of your mom as the mom, as a role, and your dad as the dad. And I got this wonderful gift in this process of discovering my mother as not the mom, but as a heroine in her own story. I would wish that for any child. And it's a love story, you know, as that develops. And I realized what an extraordinary feat it is to stay married through all of that. And to me, that's just inspiring.
Is that the kind of the connection? I know it's a very personal book. Is that kind of where that connection got made, that it came out more as something really personal for you as opposed to something kind of outside yourself, writing about these two people? How'd that come about?
It was personal, and there were also times when I had to take a little step back, you know, because, and I think it helped that I was away from the industry for a while, but personal in that, of course, I'm intensely devoted to these people. I got to know them in a way I never would have. I mean, my mother and my brothers opened their lives to me and shared incredibly personal stories and allowed it to be shared with the world, and I'm just so grateful for them and their generosity in doing that. And at times I had to pull myself back and realize that sounds like me and not my mother. This is her story, not me. I'm not editorializing here. It's her voice, not mine. My own voice is a little bit different than hers. So that was also kind of a fun process of discovering her own voice through my pen.
Oh, that's really a neat analogy about that. You know, the other thing I was going to ask, you talked a little about yourself and the family when you were young, and clearly they started this before you came around, but you wound up in a pretty prominent position, I believe, as the CEO of the company, at being the youngest and the only girl. I think that's a pretty awesome accomplishment. But what was it like for you growing up in the industry? Because you really did. I mean, it was like it had to have been from your earliest years an opportunity to be involved in and learning about something that was really kind of cutting edge. And like you say, I mean, there was a lot of people still looking at it and questioning it, but there had to be a tremendous amount of excitement.
There was excitement, and when I was a little kid, the industry was still fairly young, but I remember scampering around these trade shows and getting to know all these characters, and they, you know, patted me on the head. They all knew who I was, and sampling their tofu and carob and all the stuff that we ate at the time that wasn't that good. It didn't taste that great when I was young. And as I got older, it was almost like as I hit my teenage and early adult years, it was like the industry was maturing at the same time. And I remember the first time I showed up at a trade show and Archer Daniels Midland Company was there, supermarket to the world. And I thought, something has changed. I mean, it went from these little mom and pop companies to mega blocks of huge corporations and suits, and it was very professional and exciting to see us grown up and to see us hit the mainstream, where in a grocery store the products now talked about natural and organic and whole grain and omega-3s and all those things that we take for granted on every grocery store shelf in America. It was really fun to watch that hit the mainstream. And at the same time, there was a really big industry fight with the FDA in getting the Dietary Supplement and Health Education Act passed, DSHEA as we know it. And I remember when that passed, I was at a trade show, and I had never been prouder of our industry and of my family. My family invested heavily in sending out videos to every congressman and senator and health food store in this country, spent a year's marketing budget to help lobby for that passage so that supplements could stay safe and legal and we could talk about them in a truthful and honest way. And it felt like a victory over those bullies back in, 20 years earlier, trying to put my parents out of business.
Well, it's a great story, and I'm really pleased to have a chance to read it and to talk to you and learn a little bit more about it. And I just can only wish you the very best of success as this gets out, that maybe more people will get a chance to read it and learn more about one of the families that was really involved in the beginning of this whole movement.
Well, thanks so much, Ron.
My pleasure.